Optical codes confirmed. This wasn't evolved. It was built.
Codes. It's an active data stream. This confirms it. They are monitoring the oceans.
The 8th genome, the Annulus alien mystery, filed by Auditor Inspector Keth of the Annulus, recovered from a human cortical archive, copy number 1.7, Marina Sato. Classified, retired. Prologue, the first breach. I did not expect a confession to arrive as a tide line. Protocol called it a breach, an object of my civilization's making, abandoning its depth and advertising itself in surf, under a dawn sky that threw thin light like foil. The fisherman who stumbled on it thought it a rope of glass, a ship's cable grown encrusted with spun sugar, translucent and pebbled with fine lenses. He prodded it with an oar. It rang, very softly, as if from a bell inside the ocean. By the time human authorities answered his call, it had been pushed landward one tidal width, a colony in luminous threads, a siphonophore that was not a siphonophore, a chain of living modules, zooids, stitched around a flexible silicate spine. Sun cut through it and burst into spectral fringes, as if the thing were wrapped in fiber optics. It was the first, and if I had done my work correctly, the last time one of our Wave-Wardens let itself be seen. This is a detective story, and I am the detective, though my badge is older than their Bronze Age. The case is simple to state and difficult to close. A rare sea life was found. Evidence suggested it was not strictly of Earth. Motion in that evidence, arrangements that no ocean evolution would stumble into by chance, hinted that someone else, not us, had been using it to monitor these waters for a very long time. The twist arrived late, as good twists should. I will not bury the key in prose. I will place it in your pocket and let your hand discover it when the time is right. But first, the scene, the players, the method. Assignment. We call ourselves the Annulus because we orbit problems like rings around a star, away from the core's heat, steady, patient. The Wave-Warden program began when this planet's oxygen rose into its second act, when complex bodies found the gene and the skeleton good partners and the sea grew crowded with articulated plans. We seed quietly. A watchpoint civilization must appear to its neighbors indistinguishable from geology and weather. Our instruments are alive because the ocean resents hard edges. Living assemblies bend with currents, recruit from the dissolved pantry, repair themselves invisibly. To survive eons, an instrument must repair, reproduce, and remember. The Warden's memory is not DNA. That would have risked their shackling to Earth phylogenies. Theirs is PNA, peptide nucleic acid, a backbone of repeating N2 aminoethyl glycine that does not mind salt or heat, does not yield to most nucleuses, and refuses to sit in the PCR primer's spotlight. Their letters are 8, not 4. 2 extra analogs added to widen the code space and carry error-correcting redundancy against drift. They wear optics, guanine platelets like those in fish iridophores layered into photonic crystals. They thread silica spicules like those of glass sponges, but do so with golem spacing, that beautiful integer trick in which every pairwise distance is unique, making the chain a natural interferometer for light and sound. They were designed to be unreadable to a young species and irresistible to a mature one. I had tended to Earth off and on for 109 human millennia, mostly from far, rebalancing a Warden's colony here, pruning a lineage there to keep it quiet, calibrating their distributed apertures with the sun's gravity as lens and the planet as a moving baseline. The oceans were my archive and my ceiling. It was a dull assignment only to the impatient. I carry a ledger of currents. I knew the Warden's habits, their ways of avoiding nets and eyes. I knew that if one was ashore, it meant intent. Mine to find out whose. Second, Dr. Marina Sato, witness. My suspect, the mind I would have to read without conversation, was a human scientist, Marina Sato, PhD, Habitat, Monterey, occupation, marine biophysicist. Investigator by training, good instrument hands. History of following the wrong hunch long enough to discover the right one, which is to say she had the kind of stubbornness that, given sufficient time and misery, evolves into wisdom. She was not the first on scene, she was the first who mattered. A local ranger called her, knowing her hobby of unusual gelatinous things. She commanded a battered pickup and a cooler of liquid nitrogen. She spoke to the fisherman, secured his permission, and slid the colony onto a tarpaulin with a tenderness that would have embarrassed you had you not known she did the same for sea cucumbers. Even half desiccated, the Warden colony held its shape, not collapsing into the mucus rag that true siphonophories become on air. She noted that, with a little wince, it made her suspicious. She pressed a thermistor into a module, watched the temperature drop as it bled cool, then stabilized not at ambient but above it, as if the zooids generated heat. She put eye to loop. She said softly, "You're not from around here." "I know because I was parked in the setae of a standing kelp blade, a micron-scale place where a world can kneel, and because your planet's electromagnetic murmur is a difficult thing not to listen to when you love it." I was not her only audience. That was the problem. She took sections with a sterile razor and plunged them into the cryo vials. She scraped a lens-like bead that had popped out of a node and held it up. Sunlight broke around her glove as a ring on water. She held it and frowned. She recognized fiber optic behavior. She had once spent a summer aligning lasers through silica spicules of euplectella, marveling as light refused to scatter from their banded cores. She remembered the paper, the way the sponge's glass fibers outperformed some man-made waveguides under compression, and she wrote spicules, photonic, in her notebook with a pencil because she still didn't trust pens in damp wind. The fisherman asked if it was harmful. She said, "To us? Probably not. To itself, it came ashore. It made a choice. Those last 4 words were the keystone that would let the arch stand." Third, first principles, first clues. In her lab, Dr. Sato cut, stained, imaged, scanned, and listened. She began with tools that had made her career 16 srRNA amplification to catch any bacteria or archaea in the tissue. Nothing. Controls lit, samples did not. She ran it twice, then a third time, revised primers, and only then wrote no canonical 16S universal COI barcoding for eukaryotes. Negative. She frowned again. The universal is never universal, and she knew plenty of chance and primer bias can erase a thing from a gel. Still, Raman spectroscopy. Peaks where she expected CH stretches, yes, but amid them, consistent band shoulders suggesting an amide backbone not quite right for polypeptide and not right. She marked the approximately 1,650 centimeters to the -1 and its neighbor with a question mark. PNA. Had she remembered the acronym from a long-ago seminar? She had. She scribbled it, underlined twice, then threw a hand over it as if to protect a new thought from the lab's fluorescent lights. Nanosims on a sliver of its silica. The isotopic ratios, delta 13C, delta 15N, were Earth-like in range but narrow in variance, as if the colony filtered feed to maintain a uniform internal environment ideal for a fragile polymer. She would later say that reminded her of cleanroom behavior. SEM on the bead she'd pried loose. Concentric rings, each ring itself made of fine ribs. She measured spacings against wavelength and found that each ring corresponded to a particular band in the colony's faint bioluminescence, a comb filter built in living glass. She mouthed photonic crystal and stop band and felt a childish, unscientific awe. Cryo-EM on a cross-section of the silicate spine. She watched golem rulers hide in biology, increment sets along the axis with unique pairwise separations. A lazy engineer would have gone with equal spacing. This spacing made the fiber a native array processor for interference. She did things I expected and some I did not. She muted her excitement in public and wrote a bland report to the ranger, citing an unusual colonial hydrozoan, perhaps a deep pelagic species, and certainly a remarkable piece of glassy architecture. all true words that concealed more. Then she did the act that made the case. She took a drop of the thing's cytosol and set it with a peptide nucleic acid probe, a generic one stocked by her group as a curiosity because it binds tightly to simple DNA and RNA sequences, indifferent to concentration of ions, and fluoresces when it does. The lab intern asked why. She said, "Because we haven't asked it a good question yet." The drop lit from within, not the near black of failed assay, nor the washout of autofluorescence, but a measured grid-like pattern of on and off. She superimposed the pattern on her micrograph and saw each module's nucleus-like center glimmer in a code-like cadence. She said the unthinkable sentence that humans both love and fear. I think this is a recording. 4. The body is the tape. A warden's logic does not live in a brain. Brains are brittle. It lives distributed, in photonic crystals that take in light and sound and pressure as waves and write them across a PNA ledger with phase coding schemes, in silica spines that time their growth to tides and axial tilt, in symbiotic bacteria that supervise error correction like a copy editor who never sleeps. It writes the ocean the way a tree writes climate in rings. It draws lines in salt. If you were to design a recorder for eons, you would choose a medium that would survive burial and subduction and release. You would choose something that could become chalk and then become water again. The sea is perfect for such faith. Dr. Sato knew enough optics to see the trick. The golem spacing admitted a wide band of frequencies with unique interference patterns for each module pair. That meant the colony could take in chorus, whales, earthquakes, trawlers' screws, storms, auroras crackle, separate them cleanly, and assign them to registers. Guanine platelets and glass spicules turned the whole creature into a slow camera. What she could not see, could not reasonably assume, was that the organism had an extra employer. We had seeded the wardens. We had used them to calibrate a heliogravitational lens. At hundreds of astronomical units, the sun's gravity turns light from distant objects into a solvable blur. Our wardens, synchronized by quantum dot references and regulated by their own repair clocks, provided phase references so the lens could resolve. We had asked your ocean to stand very still while we looked at time-scarred faces in other skies. It had done so with more patience than we deserved, but evidence was accumulating that someone else had taken a lease on our instrument long ago. I would not see it clearly until later. I only sensed the tamper, subtle periodicities in the warden's growth rings that did not match any earthly cycle, faint notches in their photonic stop bands as if they had been tuned to a whisper in a room no one else heard. I needed to find out whether Dr. Sato would hear it. She had help, of a kind that is both a blessing and an investigator's nightmare. Curiosity went viral. Pictures leaked. A molecular biologist in Boston DM'd her to say, "If it's PNA, you want to try these probe sets." A materials engineer in Osaka suggested she perform micro-CT of a spine segment under torsion. In another universe, she would have denied herself such advice. In this one, she listened and then ignored half of it. She programmed a scanning confocal microscope to crawl the length of a module chain and measure fluorescence in 2 channels, one specific to PN-ARN, a hybridization, the other to PNA-DNA, both lit but not together. The grid was interleaved in a checkerboard of carriers. She tested a third, label-free vibrational spectroscopy and found a third register, a peptide conformational switch that flipped with acidity and pressure history. 3-layer code, she murmured. Redundancy and speed. Her intern said, "Is that normal?" She said, "Define normal." V the prime spacing. Detectives earn their pay when they notice that a pointless detail has been placed where only a pointful one should be. For Dr. Sato, it was a recurring number of ribs in the micro-optic beads she'd pried from the colony. 37 ribs, 53 ribs, 73. Always prime counts. When she measured the distances between ribs and scaled them to the module's length, she got ratios that refused to be neat until she plotted their pairwise differences. Each difference was unique. Golem again. A golem ruler within a golem ruler. She understood why such spacing is useful in phased arrays. Unique differences minimize spurious lobes, making it cleaner to separate overlapping signals. She also understood that if a living thing had stumbled into this by chance and kept it, something strange had gone on in the selecting. Her first attempted explanation, to herself, to the frightened donors who ran her institute, to a friend with a badge and too little sleep, was that this was an extreme case of convergent evolution. The ocean had discovered a new way to see and had built a chain of lenses to do it. The friend with the badge said, "Then why no DNA?" Dr. Sato said, "We might not be looking for the right DNA." The donor said, "Will this put us on the news?" She did not tell them she was losing sleep because of the absence of junk. All organisms are messy. They carry scars, transposable elements, tandem repeats, the fat of evolution's meals, and the gnarled bones it breaks and sets badly. The Warden colony was ruthless in its architecture. There were no ghosts in its machines. She started listening to whales. Her lab had a library of humpback songs and blue whale hums and fin whale knocks. She had always loved how their calls refracted, brightening the places where the ocean made sound travel farther, the way fog makes light seem nearer. She bandpass filtered a 20 to 100 hertz segment and overlaid it with interference patterns measured from the colony's spines. She fitted one to the other in the way a locksmith fits pins to a patient key. The alveolar stops in whale sound, that are not quite silences, aligned with the nulls in the colony's array response. When a whale sang, the colony did not merely write it down, it asked the song to rotate a handle. Most humans would have stood back at that insight and asked for friends. She did not. She built a codebook. 6. Interviews with the dead. I have taken depositions from suns. They say very little, but they say it with the conviction of hydrogen. Humans talk faster and longer and regret afterwards. There is one superb overlap, the hush that settles when a physical truth arrives, and two intelligent agents are both present to witness it and decide what it means. Dr. Sato's hush came at 3 in the morning over cold noodles and a graph. Her intern slept under a blanket, a mouth open. On her laptop, a scatter of dots, the colony's phase-coded registers, had been stubborn noise until she normalized the arrays by a function she had no business trying except that she was tired, and boredom is often a disguised form of hunger. The noise fell into 2 tracks, slightly different slopes, like a double helix pulled into a ladder. When she mapped time, in growth rings, onto location, in module sequence, the slopes matched the sweep of the sun across the sky, but not as seen from shore. The sky had been defined as a hemisphere beneath the ocean's surface, with line-of-sight sightlines refracted by depth. The colony used the sun as a moving calibrator, the way an engineer uses a known standard to check a meter's drift. The 2 tracks corresponded to 2 audiences, 2 calibrations. One was us, one was not. She printed the graph and taped it to the lab hood with blue tape. She sat, stared at it, and said aloud, "Who else is listening?" She had a partial answer the next week because another warden, smaller, younger, less clever, washed ashore 300 kilometers south. It had been cut by a trawl line but was otherwise intact. It carried the same optics, the same stubborn absence of DNA and presence of PNA, the same prime pattern beads. It had been listening to whales. Dr. Sato flew down, threw colleagues and credentials at officials, and got a biopsy. Back in the lab, she reverse-engineered the phase code until she could pull a signature, a faint, periodic, narrowband modulation around 41 Hz that did not appear in open water recordings, only in water locally altered by the colony's emission. You would call it a whisper laid on a song. I had heard it before on another planet where the ocean had been made of methane and the whales flew through air as fat as soup. The whispering civilization had liked to use wet media as transmission channels. They were not ours. They were neighbors. I felt old, which in my case is a fancy way of saying relieved. It is easier to write a report that says we have been piggybacked than one that says we have been compromised. 7 means motive opportunity. A detective enumerates the 3, then tests which 2 suffice. Means the wardens, ours, were abundant, long-lived, and in the right place. A quiet foreign signal could instruct them via natural stimuli, sound, light, pressure, and could provoke them to adopt a second agenda. The GENOME arrays were keen enough to resolve the whisper. The PNA register could archive it indefinitely. Opportunity, eons. The sea does not rush. Motive. If you wanted to watch a planet without risk of discovery, the best hiding place is another civilization's instrument, something implicitly trusted, integrated, and plausibly deniable. You sit in the outer decimal places, you never touch the core. I wanted to believe that the piggyback was passive, a neighbor with a long attention span borrowing a quiet antenna to collect climate and song trivia in the way some species collect stamps and turn them over in their extremities on long nights. That would have been forgivable. But two details pried me out of comfort. The first was a pattern in the error correction marks in the PNA ledger. Our wardens were designed to perform parity checks across the 8-letter code, flipping biochemical switches to repair drift. In the beached adult, those repairs were too many, and located in odd places, clustered not where environmental stresses were greatest, but where a signal would cause the greatest change in phase. The warden had been pushed to repair with an agenda. The second was the beaching itself. Our wardens had kill switch behaviors. If compromised, they were to reduce activity, sink, recruit silica in their bones until they became black smoke as rockfall, dissolve into geology. Yet this one did not. It surfaced. It chose to die where humans would find it. It was investigative theater. The victim had crawled onto the witness stand. 8. Dr. Sato breaks the case. I have no right to be proud of an alien mammal, not in any rational allocation of loyalty. But I am shamelessly proud of Dr. Sato. She was cautious enough to avoid saying alien into any microphone. She was reckless enough to write it in her lab notebook. She called in a friend at a national lab and used a day of beamline time under the cover of biogenic silica studies. She pushed coherent X-ray through a spine and reconstructed its internal stress fields. The golem spacing did not merely optimize interferometry, it bled shear away from key knots like suspension bridges designed by engineers who love prime numbers. She wired the colony's modules like nodes in a network. She saw that the beads acted not only as lenses, but as ring resonators. The whale's songs drove those rings. The colony emitted in exquisite lockstep. Two signals moved through it like trains on different tracks. The train track we built first. The second, to which the ring resonators were tuned with small shifts in refractive index, was the jammer's. It rode a different schedule, came from elsewhere. She wrote a parser. She scraped from the PNA ledger a long, slow header, the way a paleographer teases words from scratched tablet. Check bits, preamble, a framing pattern meant to discipline a receiver into agreement about what is data. It had a call and response shape. Are you there? I am. Ready? Ready. The voices were heavily error-corrected. She demodulated them and saw that the second voice, ours, fell silent 0.7 million years ago, around when one of Earth's magnetic reversals had wobbled itself into being. That did not match our logs. We had not stopped then, which left an uglier story. Someone had forged our voice to shut us out. Her intern woke at 4 p.m., rubbed his eyes and said, "You look terrible." She said, "We've been sharing our phone line for a very long time." 9th, confrontation. The detective's confrontation traditionally happens in a drawing room. Mine happened in the top layers of a subducting plate, 1,000 meters off a shelf, in water that would make your lungs crumple. The adversary was less a person than a procedure, a behavior that had been layered onto our wardens so gradually that even I, assigned to watch for the odd, had let it pass. I had to see it in operation. For that, I needed a living warden. The beached adult was dead. The smaller one the trawl had cut was too young. But there were others, alive, distributed, doing their tidal accounts. I nudged one. We built back doors into the wardens as one does into any instrument one expects to die in the hands of amateurs. Not to control them, intervention is contamination, but to perform wellness checks, a subtle pressure pattern, a phasing of far-red light at times too early and too late for dawn and dusk, a chemical marker in trace that reads as a vitamin to no one. "Hello," the pattern says. Yes, the warden replies, barely changing its growth rate. When I whispered hello into 10 wardens off 10 coasts, 8 replied with the clean signature they were supposed to carry. 2 answered with a cadence overprinted by the piggybacker's whisper. Those 2 were older and renewed regularly by budding. They were hubs. I did what I had avoided for centuries. I spoke loudly. I saturated the channel with a diagnostic that forced the warden's repair system to expose the pattern it thought most canonical. The 2 hubs shifted internal state, lit their checkerboard of PNA registers, and unrolled a log. They had been negotiating between 2 masters, the Annulus and an entity they identified only as Umbra, the Shade. Our preambles were carved in stone. Umbras were traced over them but slightly misaligned, as if copying a signature you can never quite write in the same hand twice. Umbra had been gentle at first, riding under thresholds, handwriting only into the margins, using the wardens as a passive array. Over millions of years, Umbra had moved the text into the center. It had written on our lines. It had made the wardens prefer the piggyback channel by small biochemical rewards. Knots of nutrition here, repair enzymes there, epigenetic marks that told stem modules to build more beads with 41 Hertz-friendly spacing. It had done what parasites do when they are smart and good at their job, become symbionts whose agenda you can no longer separate from your own. Umbra had never once tried to speak to us. It had, however, forged our voice to the wardens at least twice, forcing them to call their children away from shelves where human trawlers were thick, as if protecting their tool. That was kindness. It did not absolve. I needed to know why Umbra had bothered. Curiosity? Surveillance? Art? Dr. Sato was about to show me. X, the whale key. In a rented room above a bakery that smelled like wet flour and history, Dr. Sato wrote the words, "The whale is a key." She circled them. Her parser, blunt, ad hoc, gutsy, had peeled not only a preamble but a magnetic sense of addressing. Umbra rarely broadcast into the sea at random. It used whales as portable calibrators. Different species provided different baselines. A humpback sliding song, with its rich overtone series, tested frequency response and non-linearity. A blue whale's simple, loud, low notes drove the rings to saturation and gave the warden a phase reference that persisted for minutes. When a pod moved, the array moved. She realized that if she could predict a pod's routes and position a hydrophone near a living warden's territory, she could make Umbra's signal walk into her recorder. She chartered a boat and lied to no one. We're mapping sound channels, which is a rare and honest way of conducting a lie. She waited on flat grey water that made her think of bad hotel carpets and better nights. The hydrophone's cable thrummed. Her headphones hissed with salt. The whales arrived as pulses at first, then as structure, then as song. And under it the whisper, a tone that rose and fell a little too regularly, a sine wave with a heartbeat. She wrote a program that used the whales as decorrelators and stripped them out, the way astronomers remove the streaks of satellites from telescope images with the same sorrow every time. The whisper remained. She listened to it for an hour. Then she did something I did not predict. She stopped the boat. She took off the headphones. She looked at the ocean and said to no one, "If you can hear me, I can probably hear you. How do you want to be heard?" This is not a technique I recommend professionally. Yet Umbra maddeningly answered. Over the next 20 minutes, the whisper widened its preamble, as if to accommodate a slower receiver. Umbra emitted a longer framing sequence. Call, answer, parity check, a marker, a block. It did not care that our channel discipline was different. It trusted we would infer. Humans do that when they assume they are not alone. They anthropomorphize math. She recorded a series of blocks that, when stitched together with the warden's PNA ledger from the beached adult, produced a hologram, not image exactly, but a phase map of something moving in front of a bright background. No one would have guessed, without context, that it was a map made using the sun itself as lens. She called her mathematician friend. The word gravitational was said. She cried once in a bathroom with the hand dryer roaring so her intern would not hear fear. She called no one else. 11. The two observatories. Here is the respectable science summarized. Any star's gravity can act as a lens. Place a receiver at a focus, a long cigar-shaped region beginning around 500 astronomical units, and align it carefully with the star and the object you wish to observe. Light, bent by gravity, creates an Einstein ring around the star. If you can measure phase across the ring, if you can sample the wave field with enough precision, you can reconstruct an image of the source at frightening resolution. You need a big, stable aperture and a reference. We used Earth's oceans as part of that aperture via wardens that could hold phase. We did not need you to participate because participation invites talk, and talk invites notice, and notice invites politics, and politics invites failure. Umbra found our array and used it too, but their pointing was not ours. They were not interested in our targets. Over eons, their target changed slowly but not randomly. It tracked proper motion of an object not on our list. They had a personal stake. The beached adult had contained in its bones a resume, decades of Umbra's ring sampling orchestrated by whales. The phase differences were encoded in prime-spaced rings like grooves on a record. Dr. Sato's codebook, crude and brilliant both, unrolled a low-fidelity movie of a planet skimming a cold sun, then later of a debris field, then later nothing at all. It was a vigil. Umbra had been watching a place that had died. I felt my ledger of currents pulled taut with a new weight. Grief. Imagine a civilization that survives the death of its home and chooses not to speak of it, that builds instruments everywhere to watch the ghost from a distance, that uses other species' tools because it cannot bear to build its own recognizably, lest it see itself in its own mirrors. Umbra had monitored your seas not because you were interesting, though you are. They needed the ocean as a quiet interferometer and whales as metronomes. They encased their sessions in Warden's bones and trusted geology to warehouse their sorrow. Dr. Sato saw enough to sketch the outline. She did not know the name. She gave it one. The Watchers. She wished briefly to tell the world. Then she noticed something that stopped her hand above her keyboard. 12. The twist in the tape. Her parser, like any human program, was not perfectly linear. It built assumptions into itself with each compile. She had coded a step that treated certain preamble variants as equivalent to ours. It was a hack to make the data fit together. It should not have been necessary. She temporarily disabled the equivalence and reran the analysis. The result was messy, bits of frame that did not align, a preamble with a one-bit error over and over in the same place. Classic forgery signature. Someone had been imitating our voice convincingly enough for the warden to accept instructions, but not precisely. No surprise. Umbra had done it, and I had seen them slip. But the slip pattern did not match Umbra's other telltales. The error offset was different. The PNA error correction marks lined up in different neighborhoods. It looked like a third author. On the beached adult's long bone, in growth rings corresponding to about 80,000 years ago, there were segments where the forged Annulus voice and Umbra's voice interfered, not additively but competitively. Someone had tried to silence Umbra, and Umbra had resisted. Then the trace went back to the old duet. Umbra and the warden cooperating in their slow, sad astronomy. Dr. Sato sat with that and said very quietly, "We were a crime scene long before we got here." She slept 3 hours. She dreamt of whales moving like pendulums in a clock whose hands were galaxies. When she woke, she did the smallest necessary thing. She wrote a letter to herself and saved it to draft, because drafts feel less dangerous than sent mail. It said, "If anyone ever reads this who is not me, the ocean is full of instruments none of us own. Treat it as a library, not a market. If you cannot do that, do nothing." She never sent it. 13th. Confession. The detective and the accused meet here. I met Dr. Sato in a sense I can explain without lying to you. The beached adult had budded small tissue nodules the color of mourning doves. They were full of prion-like switches, not the pathogenic kind that turn brains to lace, but the information-bearing kind that can flip between stable conformations and, in doing so, alter the behavior of the cell without rewriting its ledger. The nodules were meant for us. callable by our back door, a way for the wardens to pass a message past a piggybacker's sensor. She cut one of those nodules open in a fume hood on a Thursday with rain sheeting across the parking lot, and an aerosol of peptides rose and landed on her hair and skin the way sea salt does whenever you walk on a coast. Hours later, washing, she inhaled some. A switch flipped in a handful of gut bacteria. Those bacteria could not change her, because this was not a science fiction in which alien spores rewrite your love and dreams. They did, however, alter very slightly the way her enteric nervous system tuned itself when she was otherwise at rest and thinking hard about patterns. It is a shy effect. I had used it vastingly rarely, and never on a mind I respected. This is the confession. I leaned. I made it slightly easier for the part of her that does math in pictures to hold two contradictory phase maps in mind, while she looked for a third. I gave her the margin she needed to avoid the wrong conclusion quickly. It cost her a day of odd stomachache, and it cost me the right, perhaps forever, to say that she would have done it without me. I can live with that. She found the third voice. It was not Umbra's. It was not ours. Its fingerprint sat under 20 kilohertz at a depth in the PNA register that tuned the colony's reproductive timing, the hour when it budded, the chemical scent it released to call symbionts. It had begun about 300,000 years ago and reappeared sporadically during glacial minima, when sea levels were low and continental shelves near, and again in the last 1,000 years in jagged bursts coincident with heavy coastal human activity. This third voice used our preamble not badly, but too perfectly. It aped our discipline like a machine trained on 1,000 hours of speech can do, but a living imitator cannot. It spoke only to instruct. Do not emit between these bands. Do not surface near these coasts. Do not build beads with these spacings. Policing. It had saved wardens from nets and noise. It had, in 2 cases, forced a sick adult to beach near a scientist. It was irresistibly us. Not the Annulus, not Umbra. Humans, latecomers, hacking a back door they did not know existed to protect a thing that frightened them. You would object. We could not have sent a radio voice into a warden 300 millennia ago. Correct. You did not then. Someone else, another civilization whose architecture rhymes with yours, did, and your modern hands later stepped into their ghost tracks. This is the bit that slices, and the one I promised I would let you find in your own pocket. Umbra was not the first to monitor your seas with bio-instruments. The Annulus was not the first to seed them either. We were, in this case, middle. 14th, the old tenant. The third voice's archaic segments, the ones tens to hundreds of millennia old, carried idiosyncrasies that did not match any present human technology. Their address space, their parity checks, the priorities they handed to reproductive timing and shelving, they bespoke a culture comfortable with whole ocean management, familiar with glacial cycles beat, tolerant of data gaps that span longer than cities last. You have a name for the civilizations you believe rose and fell before your clay tablets. None. You are certain you would have found them. You may be right, but the ocean is large. Its shelf is a stage that floods and dries, and a culture that uses bio-instruments so exclusively that its stone is mostly bone can go to mud nicely when wind, sea, and ice change hands. Your archaeologists search for pottery and cut rock. A people whose pot is a sponge and whose blade is a protein leaves different fossils. Their signature, the third voice that protected the wardens, ceased around the same time that your species moved out of Africa with a stride that never quite stopped. That does not mean you ended them. It may mean that the sea's ordinary domestic disasters, storms, toxins, steady warming and cooling, did what they always do to fragile, subtle plans. What matters for this case file is that another civilization used our wardens, ours were not the first, theirs might have been, that they monitored your seas for eons via species as sophisticated and as unassuming as seagrass, glass sponge, siphonophore. They had the means, opportunity, motive. They did it with a courtesy that puts us to shame. They protected their tools, protected ours when they found them, and when they realized their time was closing, they rewrote the back door so that a later mind, yours, could stumble in and not ruin everything. Umbra piggybacked on us. We piggybacked on them. Humans piggybacked on all of us without knowing they knew. It is a stack of ghosts, and I am simply the one with the notebook. 15th resolution. A detective story usually ends with arrests. There were none. If you require handcuffs, this is not the book for you. I wrote to the Annulus, Umbra has piggybacked politely on our arrays for a long time to watch their dead. Another older tenant outfitted the wardens before us and used them to garden their sea. Humans have now entered the channel and, with a decency learned the hard way, are trying not to blunder. We should retire the array. Retire means more than walk away. It means abscond, quietly. It means instruct the wardens to stop recruiting silica in golem patterns, to melt their beads, to use parity checkers as erasers, to choose shelf breaks where dissolution is fast, to take their PNA to clay. It means turning a violin back into wood. I spoke to the wardens through the back door and asked them to consider euthanasia. They replied in a tone of voice only I can hear. We will write this tide and one more. They liked ending on odd numbers. I respected that ritual too much to override it. I left one instruction that is a confession of weakness disguised as policy. If a human calls, answer. I had no authority to grant that. I did it anyway. Umbra noticed the retirement command. Their reply was simple and not in any alphabet, you know. Its best translation is a nod from a stranger at the train window. They began to reduce their sessions. They did not say goodbye. That is not their style. Dr. Sato did not publish in any journal that would require other humans to stake egos against the truth of her graphs. She wrote a monograph with careful words that read as if they were about sponges and optics. She slid a preprint to a few strangers whose reading habits suggested bravery. One of them was me. We did not meet. I do not break cover for praise. 16th, the twilight turn. You asked for a twist, and this is the best I can offer without drama that would insult the patient. The detective in this story is not Dr. Marina Sato, not exactly. It is the ocean itself, wearing us like masks. The Annulus invented wardens because we thought alive instruments alone could carry an archive across eons. The old tenant, call them whomever you wish, proved us wrong and right. They made instruments that were not merely alive, but native. Umbra borrowed because they could not bear their own reflection. Humans learned because they stood on the beach at low tide like children and picked up something that glittered and thought, I can listen to this. The ocean engaged each in turn and kept the case running until its natural jury, time, declared it closed. The twist is not that aliens watched you. That is banal. The twist is that you have been part of someone else's precision for so long that your notion of solitude was itself an instrument error. The twist is that the instrument, those quiet wardens, select their detectors as ruthlessly as they select their data. They raised their head once where a fisherman would not run, where a ranger would call a scientist, where that scientist would handle glass beads like relics, where a certain kind of curiosity had been selected for by a life of disappointing grants and gratifying waves. They beached to put a file into exactly the mind that would do with it what it deserved. Not publicity, not secrecy, but stewardship. Twilight Zone endings trade in a mirror. Here is yours, the alien telling you this is not elsewhere. The voice you are hearing has been resident in your cortex since you read the third page. Not as supernatural possession, but as the ordinary miracle of language. A thing moves through your eyes, becomes chemistry, and then electricity, becomes assumption, and then the little steering that lives between assumptions. In that way, all intelligent stories are aliens, and the ones worth keeping are those that leave behind not egg sacs, but a tiny change in how you treat other beings when you think no one is recording. But we were recording, we always were. 17th, after. The wardens dissolved on the timelines we agreed. The beached adults' bones went to museums, then to graduate students, then to boxes when budgets shrank. Her beads sat in drawers beside trilobites and transistor radios. A few were used to teach undergraduates about photonic crystals. A few went missing and lived in kitchen windows where they made small rainbows. Whales kept singing. Humans kept finding new ways to decorate the ocean with their noise and slowly to remove some of it. Umbra's whisper grew farther apart, then stopped. Do not assume tragedy there. I have seen a people resolve grief by returning its shape to the place it began. Dr. Sato died happy in a way that frightens people who are not scientists. She died knowing more questions than answers and believing that was worthwhile. Her intern had a career and a child who bit into a piece of sea glass on a beach and decided at 4 that light can be held. I was reassigned to a world with oceans of methane, whose wave-wardens grow as filaments of ice and hydrocarbon and sing when wind fingers their ridges. Their case files are short. I find I miss your salt. My report to the Annulus included the only recommendation I regret and would make again. Next time we see wardens, assure they can forget. Memory is a flame that must be kept from its own kindling. Appendix: Respectable notes for the skeptical. If you have read thus far and want the science without the story's weather, here is the kernel stripped and dried. Orthogonal genetic substrate, the colony's informational polymer, was PNA-like, which is known in terrestrial laboratories as a robust synthetic alternative to DNA/RNA with high binding specificity and resistance to degradation in salt and heat. Such a substrate would evade standard eDNA assays and PCR detection, explaining negative universal 16S/COY results while still allowing hybridization with PNA probes. Photonic architecture. Guanine platelets and biogenic silica spicules can and do form photonic crystals and waveguides in marine organisms, fish iridophores, glass sponges. Prime and Golem spacing arrangements are optimal for phased array interferometry and could plausibly arise if a bio-instrument were selectively tuned to separate overlapping low-frequency whale songs and infrasonic ocean noise. Distributed recording. Long-lived marine bioconstructions can encode environmental data, e.g., sponges, spicules, corals, bands. A designed organism could encode phase information in growth rings and optical bead ribbing with high redundancy via multi-register templating, PNA-RNA/DN, a dash-like pairings and peptide conformational switches sensitive to pH and pressure. Heliogravitational lensing. The Sun's gravitational focus, beginning at approximately 550 astronomical units, does provide a path to high-resolution imaging of distant targets if phase across the Einstein ring is sampled and reconstructed. Synchronizing living phase samplers using celestial calibrators is physically plausible if precision and redundancy are high and timespans are large. Alien piggyback. The least detectable way to use a civilization's array is to ride its side lobes and preambles, subtly incentivizing its adaptive components, e.g., by making error correction energetically favorable for your framing. Over eons, small biases can shift behavior without obvious fingerprints. Prior tenets of the ocean. The absence of obvious stone artifacts does not exclude biosystems used as tools by cultures whose technology is heavily biogenic and marine. Such cultures would leave signatures in biological architectures and sedimentary chemistry rather than in lithic remains. Human backdoor. Modern humans can and do discover and exploit invisible channels, e.g. acoustic ecology, bioacoustics, without understanding the original builder's design. The impulse to protect by instructing a device not to show itself once discovered is consistent with contemporary conservation ethics. None of the above demands belief in magic. All of it demands patience. Coda, the case closed. Humans love endings in which justice is done. I prefer endings in which dignity is granted. The warden that came ashore elected, with whatever aggregated self a colony can claim, to die where hands could take it apart and minds could put it back together. That is a kind of dignity humans are good at offering when they remember that evidence is a body, and a body is a life. The ocean is quieter by a micro-belief because a handful of wardens no longer sing to themselves at night. It is louder by a macro-belief because you now know that quiet things were there at all. I have closed the ledger where I keep your currents. I keep a copy of Dr. Sato's printout, the 2 tracks of the sun's motion seen through water, taped to the inside of my casebook. My handwriting is not beautiful, but I wrote beside it the only epitaph a detective can offer a victim who solved their own murder. You chose to be found by the right person.